the fatal mistake that destroyed Rome. By the 2nd century AD, Rome controlled roughly 2 million square miles of territory, stretching from the fog of northern Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia. That number alone was supposed to be the proof of invincibility. A state that large, with that many legions, that much grain, that much gold, surely nothing could touch it. This was the logic Roman senators repeated to each other for generations, and on paper, it was airtight. But size is not the same thing as strength, and Rome's own success had quietly rewritten the rules it was playing by. Every mile of border the empire pushed outward was another mile that needed to be guarded, another supply line that needed to be fed, another local population that needed to be managed, taxed, or pacified. The frontier that once ran a few hundred miles from Rome eventually stretched thousands of miles from it, defended by an army that couldn't be everywhere at once, because no army can. Here's the part that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Rome didn't get weaker because barbarians got stronger, though that's the version most people remember. It got weaker because the empire had built a body too large for its own nervous system. Messages from the eastern frontier could take weeks to reach the capital. Legions stationed in Gaul had no real-time knowledge of a crisis unfolding in Syria. By the time Rome could react to a threat, that threat had often already become a catastrophe. And so came the slow, almost administrative unraveling. Emperors began splitting the empire in half just to make it governable, not out of ambition, but out of exhaustion. Legions were pulled from one border to reinforce another, leaving the abandoned frontier exposed the moment they left. Local commanders, tired of waiting for orders that arrived too late to matter, started making their own calls, then their own alliances, then their own bids for power. The empire wasn't being invaded so much as it was quietly deciding, region by region, that Rome could no longer help it anyway. What makes this collapse almost uncomfortable to sit with is that every step of it looked like success while it was happening. Conquering new land was a victory lap. Expanding trade routes was progress. Building more roads, more forts, more provinces, all of it read as strength on the way in. Nobody in the Senate stood up and said this is the year we became too big to defend ourselves, because that sentence only makes sense looking backward. Rome didn't die from an enemy it couldn't beat. It died from a map it couldn't stop drawing, and 400 years later, a very different kind of empire on the other side of the world would make almost the same mistake, just with a messenger instead of a map. The fatal mistake that destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire. What if the single deadliest decision in medieval history wasn't made on a battlefield, wasn't whispered in a war council, but happened in the marketplace of a mid-sized trading town, by a governor who simply didn't like the look of some strangers? In 1218, the Khwarezmian Empire controlled most of Central Asia and Persia, a genuine superpower built on Silk Road wealth, with a ruler, Shah Muhammad II, who commanded an army large enough to make his neighbors nervous and his own advisors confident. Confidence, as it turned out, was the problem. When Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan of roughly 450 merchants to Otrar, a Khwarezmian border city, he wasn't testing the Shah's army. He was proposing commerce. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, accused the caravan of spying, seized their goods, and had nearly every one of them executed. Genghis Khan's response to this was not immediate rage. It was something colder. He sent a formal delegation of 3 ambassadors to demand the governor be handed over for punishment, a request that, by the diplomatic customs of the era, was almost restrained. Shah Muhammad's answer was to execute the lead ambassador and send the other 2 back with their beards burned off. This is the moment historians point to as the actual declaration of war, not because Genghis Khan needed a reason to expand his empire, but because the Shah had just handed him one wrapped in personal insult. What followed wasn't a war in any conventional sense. It was closer to an erasure. Mongol forces moved through Otrar, Bokhara, Samarkand, and Urgench with a speed and coordination that no Persian or Central Asian army had ever encountered, cities that had stood for centuries reduced to rubble within months. Bokhara's population was largely killed or enslaved. Samarkand, one of the great intellectual centers of the Islamic world, never fully recovered its former population for generations. Contemporary chroniclers, writing in the decades after, described entire regions of Khorasan where the irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for 1,000 years were deliberately destroyed, turning farmland back into desert. Shah Muhammad himself fled east, then west, then died alone on a small island in the Caspian Sea, reportedly wrapped in the rags of his own soldiers because he had nothing else left to wear. The empire he'd built, the one his governors had been so certain could withstand any threat, ceased to exist as a functioning state within 2 years of that first execution in Otrar. There's a particular kind of irony historians return to again and again with this one. Genghis Khan, before Otrar, showed little interest in conquering the Khwarezmian Empire at all. He wanted trade routes open, not new provinces to administer. The single costliest strategic error in the empire's history wasn't a failure of military planning or economic policy. It was a border official's decision to treat a business opportunity as a threat, and a ruler's decision to back that mistake with his own pride rather than correct it while correction was still possible. Rome fell because it grew too large to defend itself. The Khwarezmian Empire fell because one man's ego turned a caravan of merchants into a declaration of war it could never survive, and a few centuries later, a very different empire would prove that even a father's love for his sons could be just as fatal. The fatal mistake that destroyed the Ottoman Empire's golden age. In the autumn of 1553, Suleiman the Magnificent summoned his own son, Sayyid Saad Mustafa, into his tent under the pretense of a family reconciliation. Mustafa walked in expecting an embrace. What he found instead were mute executioners, waiting in the shadows of the tent's inner chamber, acting on orders his own father had signed. Mustafa was strangled with a silk bowstring within minutes, in front of witnesses who could do nothing but watch the empire's most capable heir die on his father's word. He wasn't a traitor. He wasn't plotting rebellion, at least not by any evidence that has survived. He was popular with the army, respected by the janissaries, and increasingly seen by the court as a natural successor, which, in the poisonous logic of Ottoman succession politics, made him dangerous simply by existing. This is the part that tends to surprise people who assume empires fall from outside pressure alone. The Ottomans had no fixed rule of succession. There was no eldest son guarantee, no council-appointed heir, no orderly transition written into law. Every sultan's death triggered what historians have bluntly termed a fight to the death among his sons, because whoever seized the throne first would typically have his brothers executed to eliminate future rivals. It wasn't a bug in the system. For generations, it was treated as the system. Suleiman didn't invent this practice, but his reign is where its cost became undeniable. Behind Mustafa's execution stood the influence of Hurrem Sultan, Suleiman's wife, who had spent years positioning her own sons for the throne and was widely believed by contemporaries to have helped engineer suspicion against her stepson. What followed wasn't peace. It was a narrowing. The strongest, most battle-tested claimant to the Ottoman throne was gone, and the field was left to sons chosen less for competence than for who had survived the court's internal war of nerves. Suleiman's eventual successor, Selim II, became known to history by a nickname his own subjects gave him, Selim the Sot, a ruler more devoted to wine than to statecraft, who reportedly died after slipping in his own bathhouse. This was not a random accident of genetics. It was the predictable output of a selection process that filtered for survival in a palace knife fight rather than skill in governing a continent-spanning empire. And here's the turn most people don't expect: the practice didn't stop. It intensified. Later sultans, learning from Suleiman's era, began having brothers not just executed but sometimes confined for life in isolated palace chambers, a practice historians call the cage, raising future rulers with zero administrative experience, no exposure to the army, No real understanding of the empire they'd one day inherit blind. Each generation of succession crisis produced a slightly weaker sultan than the one before, not because Ottoman bloodlines grew less capable, but because the empire kept discarding its most capable heirs and elevating whoever survived the palace, not whoever could run the state. By the late 17th century, the empire that once stood at the gates of Vienna was being governed by men who'd spent their entire lives in confinement, utterly unprepared for the job they inherited. Rome fell to the weight of its own size. The Khwarezmian Empire fell to a governor's wounded pride. The Ottomans fell to something quieter and more devastating, a family that never figured out how to hand power to the next generation without destroying its best options first. And somewhere in that same century, on the other side of the Atlantic, a very different empire was making an equally fatal bet, this time on gold instead of blood. If you're finding these patterns as unsettling as we do, this is exactly the kind of history this channel exists to dig into. Subscribe, because the next mistake is even harder to look away from. The fatal mistake that destroyed Spain's golden age. Picture two ships arriving in Seville in the same decade. One carries silver by the ton, more precious metal than most European kingdoms had seen in a generation. The other carries wool, cloth, tools, and grain, grown and manufactured by ordinary Spanish hands. By every measure that mattered to a 16th century treasury, the first ship looked like the future. The second looked like something Spain could always get to later. That assumption turned out to be the single most expensive miscalculation in the empire's history. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain extracted an almost unimaginable volume of silver and gold from its colonies in Peru and Mexico, most notably from the mountain of Potosi, a single site so productive it briefly became one of the largest cities in the world purely to service its mines. Spanish monarchs used this flow of bullion to fund armies, wars, palaces, and a level of European dominance no other kingdom could match. For nearly a century, it looked like Spain had discovered a permanent shortcut to power. Here is the truth that Spain's own treasury refused to see while it was happening: money is not wealth. Silver is only valuable because of what it can be exchanged for, and Spain, flush with more bullion than any nation in history, systematically neglected the one thing that actually generates lasting prosperity: the capacity to produce goods. While gold and silver poured in from the Americas, Spanish agriculture stagnated, domestic manufacturing withered, and skilled labor increasingly left for more economically dynamic regions. The empire had structured its entire economy around extraction rather than production, and extraction, unlike production, cannot compound. It can only run out, or be spent faster than it arrives, and Spain managed to do both. The mechanism of the collapse was almost mathematically predictable once you see it in motion. With so much silver flooding into Spain, prices across the domestic economy rose dramatically, a phenomenon economic historians later termed the price revolution. Spanish goods became more expensive than goods manufactured in England, France, or the Dutch Republic, which meant Spanish merchants increasingly lost ground to foreign competitors even within Spain's own colonial markets. The empire was, in effect, using American silver to buy foreign manufactured goods, funneling its own treasure straight into the economies of its rivals. Meanwhile, the crown's spending habits made the underlying fragility worse, not better. Spanish monarchs borrowed heavily against future silver shipments to fund near-constant wars across Europe, wars against the Dutch, wars against England, wars in Italy, wars that consumed resources faster than any American mine could replace them. The crown defaulted on its debts at least 4 times during this period, a staggering admission for a state that supposedly controlled the richest source of precious metal on the planet. The gold was real. The wealth it was supposed to represent was not. By the mid-1600s, the mines at Potosi were producing less, the population of skilled Spanish laborers had thinned, and the manufacturing base that could have sustained the empire independently of its colonies simply didn't exist at the scale it needed to. Spain hadn't built an economy. It had built a pipeline, and pipelines, once the source starts running dry or the destination stops needing what flows through them, don't fail gracefully. They just stop. What makes this particular mistake so quietly devastating is that it didn't look like decline while it was happening. It looked like the opposite. Spanish court chroniclers of the era wrote about the empire's wealth with the same confidence Roman senators once had about their borders, the same certainty Suleiman's advisors once had about their palace. Every ship of silver arriving in Seville felt like proof of permanence. Nobody in the treasury was tracking the slow erosion of the industries and skills that couldn't be shipped across an ocean. Rome grew too large to defend. The Khwarezmians provoked an enemy they underestimated. The Ottomans consumed their own best heirs. Spain mistook the appearance of wealth for wealth itself, and spent a century discovering the difference the hard way. And on the far side of the world, an empire that believed it needed nothing from the outside at all was about to learn a version of the same lesson, from the opposite direction. The fatal mistake that destroyed the Qing dynasty. For most of the 18th century, the Qing court operated under a belief that felt less like arrogance and more like settled fact: China needed nothing from the outside world. Emperor Qianlong made this explicit in 1793. When a British delegation led by Lord Macartney arrived bearing telescopes, clocks, and manufactured goods meant to open trade relations. Qianlong's written response to King George III still survives, and its central line is almost breathtaking in its confidence that the Celestial Empire possessed all things in abundance and had no need for the products of foreign manufacture. That single sentence, more than any battle or treaty, captures the entire mechanism of what followed. While European powers spent the late 18th and early 19th centuries locked in feverish competition, developing steam power, mechanized textile production, modern artillery, and industrial shipbuilding, the Qing court treated these developments as irrelevant to a civilization it considered already complete. There was no comparable urgency in Beijing, no institutional appetite to study what foreign engineers were building, because the entire framework of the court assumed foreign nations existed on the periphery of what mattered, not at its center. The tension in this didn't announce itself as crisis. For decades, it simply sat there, quiet and structural, while Qing military technology remained largely unchanged and European industrial capacity compounded year over year. Historians looking back can trace almost the exact moment the gap became unbridgeable, somewhere in the early 1800s, though nobody inside the Qing court could have named that moment while it was happening, because nothing had visibly broken yet. Nothing forces you to reconsider your assumptions until the day something finally does. That day arrived in 1839, when Qing efforts to shut down the British opium trade triggered the First Opium War, and the resulting collision revealed, in the span of a few catastrophic naval engagements, exactly how far the gap had grown. British steam-powered gunboats, ironclad and cannon-equipped, dismantled Qing coastal defenses that had gone essentially unmodernized for a century. It wasn't a close fight. It wasn't even a fight in the conventional sense. It was a demonstration of what happens when one side spends 100 years assuming it has nothing left to learn, while the other spends that same century learning everything it could. What makes the fall of the Qing dynasty distinct from Rome's overextension, the Khwarezmians' provocation, the Ottomans' succession wars, or Spain's gold obsession, is that this empire didn't collapse from doing too much. It collapsed from doing nothing, from mistaking centuries of internal stability for evidence that the outside world had stopped mattering, and by the time the Qing court finally moved to modernize its military and industry in the late 19th century, in what historians call the self-strengthening movement, the gap it was trying to close had already widened into something no single reform could undo, leaving an empire that had once commanded a quarter of the Earth's population sliding, piece by piece, treaty by treaty, into the very irrelevance it had once been so certain could never touch it. Thank you for watching all the way through. I'll see you in the next one.